Welcome to those joining the Maven Lightning lesson. Drop a quick intro in the chat. Let me know where you're calling in from. We had 100 or more people sign up for the Lightning lesson, so we'll give a few minutes for people to join. If you've attended these in the past, all sessions are recorded. A recording goes out 24 to 48 hours after the event. Before we jump in, we're going to be covering how to apply jobs to be done research methods, both qualitative and quantitative. We're going to be using the lens of the 4 stages of demand to frame the discussion. But give me an indication of your background or experience as it relates to jobs to be done research. Put in the chat whether you're completely new to jobs to be done research, whether you have experience in qualitative research or quantitative, and or both. Just give me a little context to where you're coming from and what you've done to date in regards to jobs to be done research. All right. Let me start with a quick introduction to myself. My name is John Gussef. I'm the founder and chief experience officer at a company called Customer Centric Solutions, LLC. I've been teaching on the Maven platform since May of 2023, really in 2 areas of domain. One, jobs to be done research methods, teaching foundations on jobs to be done research, teaching interview skills, teaching how to run switch interviews, and teaching the different methods, progress versus process, so that people can pick and choose the right method for their particular application. I also do teaching on applying behavioral science to product experience design, leveraging the Make It toolkit. So 2 areas of teaching. Jobs to be done is something I've been doing for over a decade, applying it to my client work, both B2C and B2B. So much of what I'm teaching you and presenting today is based upon the actual methods and processes I use with clients in my daily work. All right, let's jump in. I find that for the most part, jobs to be done as a theory is recognized quite widely, right? And at some degree, it's everywhere, and yet it's nowhere. Because many people, while understanding the general principle or concepts of jobs to be done research, haven't really applied it with any level of rigor and or repeatability. And I would characterize that in 2 contexts. One of the things I see is that from a qualitative side, people might entertain jobs to be done as a way of forming an initial hypothesis around customer goals or objectives or unmet needs, either informally or through formal customer interviews. Jobs to be done might inform the initial start of determining what to build and why, but that oftentimes it gets set aside when it comes to ongoing product strategy, prioritization, and or roadmap decisions. So lacking a rigor in terms of how people integrate it into their daily working activities. In addition, it's sometimes simply cornered in orientation around product and not necessarily leveraged to the degree it can around marketing, which I see a great opportunity for jobs to be done research, not only to inform what I would call product market, but also language market. So how we speak about the product to a targeted customer set. Secondly, on the quant side, people might have done initial qualitative research, but the quant gets skipped. They don't make that transition from defining jobs, putting together a job map, identifying all the associated outcomes, and really leveraging those to prioritize or identify where to focus and why, who to build for, what are the unmet needs from a quantitative standpoint, and how might you think about segmenting your customers. That it's considered sometimes to be too difficult or too time consuming, or not simply having the time to do it, or not having really the right methods or tools to perform it. So we're going to speak to both the qualitative and the quantitative side today. And we're going to talk about them within the context of what I call the spectrum of demand. And the spectrum of demand is really this identification or acknowledgement that demand occurs in stages, that demand forms and develops and builds over time from a latent stage. And I would define the latent stage of demand as being really the case where the problem really hasn't even been named yet. There's that whatever someone's doing is no longer working. They know there's a better way of doing things, but they really haven't been able to name it, to define it, and or associate that new way of doing things with what's not working. Secondly, there's an emerging stage where the actual struggles begin to surface, where people are trying to solve the underlying problems or issues, but they're doing it in kind of haphazard ways, through workarounds, through duct taping things together, putting together half-baked solutions without really solving the true problem. And they're still in this mode of seeking or searching for new ways of doing things. To a third stage of demand, which I call pattern, where we begin to identify customer groups having similar struggles or scenarios in which they're solving them in more repeatable patterns. So this is our early stage customers. We're starting to identify motivations and reasons for switching, for firing their old way of doing things, hiring a new way of doing things. And we're starting to figure out different patterns in terms of why certain segments are buying or hiring our solutions and why others aren't. To then what I would call the scalable stage, where that demand becomes much more consistent and measurable. There are very distinct segments and patterns. Switching becomes more predictable and repeatable and so forth. And so you can think of this spectrum of demand as the stages of demand as it relates to product market fit, right? Where by the time we get to this pattern stage, some level of product market fit has been uncovered or determined, but it's not yet been scaled, right? And so all companies from the standpoint of a startup are going through this process of, in some cases, having built something in search of a problem to solve, a build first mentality, find the customer secondly, or others who follow a rigorous method of defining that demand in that late and emerging stage to then inform what to design or build. And we're going to talk to a case study today of a company that did just that, where they started by simply studying latent demand before they even set out to define or build the first product they went to market with. That company is a company called Ramp, who you may or may not know of, but you can find them at ramp.com, who really focused on this area of expense management. And Ramp was founded in 2019. And at the time, most corporate credit cards being offered to businesses were very similar in nature to the credit cards being offered to consumers, with this idea that the more you spend, the more rewards you get. Now, you can imagine in a business context that your average CFO is not too enamored with this idea of spend more, right? That they want to control costs. They want to manage expense. They want to manage forecasts. They want to manage cash flow. And so Ramp, in its early stage discovery, really uncovered and found this disconnect that where there was a corporate card offering that was being positioned in much the same way as it was to consumers, to businesses. And so they initially formed this new and differentiated positioning on this idea of positioning their offering as the corporate card that helps you spend less. Now, they didn't arrive at that of their own doing. They originated their company by interviewing 150 plus founders, CFOs, finance teams, and so forth to arrive at that core insight or understanding of a target market, a very unique need that they felt they could position and build product for to support their business growth as a startup. And as a result of that process, have saved companies over $1 billion, along with tens of millions of hours in terms of how financial teams basically manage and monitor and control. So when you look at the arc of ramp in relation to these stages of demand, there was a latent stage of demand, right? That was when they were initially doing these 150 plus buyer interviews, where they started to see these themes, this concern of what you can't manage, you can't see, of the financial controls breaking down, of people on financial teams struggling to manage and approve expenses, getting cash flow surprises, difficult manual reconciliation processes, and so forth. And so they've set out to build their first solution, had their first customer in August of 2019, and then began to build towards this vision of how might we offer a unique and differentiated product, which is a card that helps you spend less or a card that helps you spend smarter, not more. Received their first Series A funding, $15.5 million in January 2020, and an evaluation of $85 million. So not significant in terms of future evaluation forecast, but had their first set of customers, 100 core business customers, beginning to use its corporate card, simply managing the challenges of kind of this broken process of people using spreadsheets and cash advance workarounds, people taking money out of their own pocket to deal with keeping the business afloat, things of that nature, to then arriving at a stage where they began to integrate these two worlds, two things that had been solved independently, corporate card, expense management, and where their customers began to see them as a single system and began to buy Ramp services for both the card offering itself, as well as the expense management and workflow processes that went alongside it. Got their Series B funding, went on to get their Series C funding, and the rest is history. And they definitely evolved and formed through this pattern of demand, leveraging both qualitative and quantitative insights to evolve their overall product offering, the areas they focused on, and the customers they serve. And so we're going to use this backdrop of Ramp as a way of articulating how these two different methods of jobs to be done research, qualitative and quantitative, support these four stages of demand. We're going to identify one aspect of jobs to be done research as a method that I would characterize as jobs to be done as progress. And so this is jobs to be done performed as qualitative research, with the goal and objective to understand the situational context of any given consumer or customer, to understand the desired progress or outcomes they seek to achieve, and to understand the switching behavior for those customers. So focused on struggles, cycle of progress, forces and desires, switching behavior. On the why people switch, on the what is the struggle, on the forces that are at play. And so this particular method of jobs to be done research is along the lineage of Bob Moesta, who informed this new method of thinking about demand side sales versus supply side sales. So not selling your product, but understanding how people buy. And then the second method of jobs to be done research, quantitative based, we're going to define as jobs to be done as process. So a much more structured way of going about jobs to be done research, much more oriented around the how many, how much, the with segments. So much more quantitative in nature, dealing with how we design in surveys, how we do scoring of importance or satisfaction in relation to jobs or outcomes, how we do opportunity ranking, how we do thematic analysis, how we do segmentation. So two methods, both from the same lineage of job theory and understanding jobs to be done through a customer lens to inform how we mature and develop products over time. Now, which method you use, to me, differs by what stage of demand you're in, mostly from the standpoint of the percentage of allocation to qual versus quant at any given stage of the business. Obviously, very early stage in this latent demand stage where you're first just simply trying to uncover like problem solution fit, you're going to be much more qualitative and focused, right? Hence the 150 plus interviews that Ramp did with a customer base. Really focuses on just identifying the problem to go after, why to go after it, why it was critical or important to the individuals they were solving for. To later stage, Ramp is probably one of the most data-driven companies you'll find, where each and every product decision in terms of what to build next and for whom is driven through very data-driven analytics. So that mix of qual to quant differing across the stages of demand, both applying at all stages, but a different mix at any given stage. For jobs to be done process, the particular method or framework that I use to do this type of research is informed, again, by Bob Moesta's lineage of this idea of understanding the timeline or the cycle of progress. And so studying and understanding how people go from first thought or struggling moment to passively looking for solutions, to actively looking for solutions, to deciding, to hiring and firing. And I use the words hiring and firing because when you hire something, you typically fire something that wasn't working. And so we're studying that cycle of progress from context of what I'm currently doing isn't working anymore. There's got to be a better way of doing it, to how I discover, uncover, evaluate, and reach decisions around new products and solutions, my consumption experience of using them, and then this final stage of continuous use, which is really just this decision of, is it working? If it's working, I don't seek new solutions. But if what I hired is no longer serving my needs, I fall into this cycle again of passively looking, actively looking, deciding, and hiring, and so forth. So I have this concept of cycle of progress. We're always seeking ways to make progress, whether as individuals or as businesses. So we're going to use this lens as our backdrop to how we begin to think about how qualitative might apply in these early stages of demand. So we're going to start with the latent stage of demand. So this idea that the problem exists, but no one has named it yet. Trying to prove that the struggle is real. And there's this idea in jobs to be done that the size of the total addressable market is less critical than the size of the struggle. No one's going to buy our product unless it meets a struggling moment that's critical in nature and important to solve. And so when you do this type of research in relation to the latent stage, to prove that demand is truly there, I find that there are 4 key signals. One, that the struggle is acute. There's signs that something important is breaking or failing. The second signal you're looking for is that workarounds exist. And this is the idea that the problem is of importance because people are willing to spend time and energies to try to fix it or solve it. But typically they're solving it in a way that's not sustainable over time. They're hacking solutions together. They're using tools that maybe shouldn't be used for what they're being used for. And then organizations grow and scale, those workarounds at some point in time no longer work. Third, that even though they've semi-solved it, they're still actively looking. They're still seeking new solutions. And that fourth, the time pressure is real, that this is something they need to solve quickly. And so this is evidenced in the qualitative research done for RAMP in terms of the different signals observed throughout the interviews, whether it be a head of growth, a CMO, a CFO, a VP of finance, all providing indications of these four signals being present. Cash flow instability threatens the business itself, that people are trying to compensate for these broken systems, but they know they can't, that won't work for the long term. That buyers are self-directed and they're actively seeking solutions. They're looking at product reviews, they're taking part in demos, they're evaluating products and so forth. And that there's some triggering moment back to this framework of the cycle is that there's always a triggering event that causes someone to move from passively looking to actively looking, from actively looking to deciding to eventually hiring. Something that's gone on in the business that makes this more critical, more important to solve, whether it's a missed forecast, a lost client, something that's leading them to make progress sooner and quicker. So that's one lens of qualitative research that you don't get with quantitative. You really don't uncover these four signals without qualitative customer research. As we move out of the latent stage into the emerging stage, these struggling moments begin to sharpen, and we begin to understand why people are making the switch. So this is the stage for RAMP, where all of a sudden now they had 100 customers who were using their new corporate card, were using the initial tools that were provided them. And so they had some initial definition of choice. Now, there's two things we're trying to do at this stage. We're trying to inform what I would call a desire for progress state. And you can think of these as the narratives that define your targeted segments. The formula is this: when we want to, so we can, and avoid. And so this notion that there's a trigger or a situational context. There's something that puts them in demand. Demand has been created due to this particular trigger. There's a push of a current struggle. So there's a pain point that needs to be resolved. There's a pull of a future promise, but with some level of constraints. There's always constraints. There's a core functional need, some new possibility or capability. In the case of RAMP, the new capability was business card and expense management as a combined solution, not as separate things that were cobbled. A desire for progress, some aspirational or emotional or social outcome they're seeking to achieve, and then an avoidance, some negative consequence if they don't solve this sooner rather than later. So when we're doing qualitative research, these are some of the storylines we're seeking to understand in relation to our customer segments. And so we interviewed 10 different synthetic customer segments. And these are just examples of kind of how those stories begin to play out, whether I'm talking to a CMO or a procurement manager. And so different combinations of firmographics, size of organization, stage of growth, type of industry they're in, and so forth. And what you begin to uncover really is this notion, and this is core to job series, this idea that people hire your product to make progress. And what you need to understand is what their job to be done is, what they're hiring your product to do. And what you find that even though they're all hiring the same product, they're all hiring it for different reasons, for different pressures, for different paces, for different risks, for different outcomes. And so if you're comparing and contrasting the story of the CFO in a B2B SaaS company, it's going to differ greatly from the procurement manager in a construction company. Cash flow or cash flow management, while a common function of managing income and expense and the timing of them, means different things to different industries. And so managing cash flow for e-commerce is all about buying goods at the lowest unit cost of you can to selling them at peak periods to make profit margins. Cash flow for construction management is all about physical goods and supply to support execution of the projects. And so even though the tooling may be similar, the problems that you're solving is very different. And then the third thing, and this is a common focus of qualitative research in this emerging stage, is really decoding the switching moment. And we define the switching moment through this forces and desires model. And the idea is for any switch to occur. Now, a switch is defined as firing the old way of doing things, hiring the new way of doing things. That for that switch to occur, promoting progress forces, the pushes, the desires, the pulls, have to outweigh blocking progress forces, the status quo, your anxieties and fears, the things you're seeking to avoid. And so unless you're able to reach a point in time for a targeted customer where those promoting forces outweigh blocking forces, switching never occurs, which is true for most B2B buying decisions. It's said that 60% of the time status quo wins, that people don't make a hiring decision. They just stick with the status quo. So we see this in every deal, in every opportunity with customers where these blocking forces, blocking progress forces often outweigh the promoting forces. And so in RAMP's context, we found 3 different themes around these. We found a theme around efficiency and spend control, risk and vendor growth and agility. And so in essence, 3 different switching moments. In one context, buyers switched when the manual work, the poor visibility, the policy enforcement could no longer scale with the business. In the second context, buyers switched when the risk of staying with legacy processes exceeded the risks of modernization. And in the third context, buyers switched when the cost of delayed decision and missed growth outweighed the fear of change. So 3 very distinct contexts for why people bought and the different risk factors they were considering when choosing RAMP. So very critical and core to your messaging from a marketing standpoint, very critical to how you manage the account and the engagements, and how you help buying committees reach a conclusion that now's the time to change. All right. So that's the qualitative side of this talk, and we'll pause there for some Q&A. And then also just profile, I'll be running a workshop July 8th. So one of the new things that's come to Maven is this idea of workshops versus courses. Courses are typically multi-day events. Workshops are single-day events. And so this is a 3-hour workshop really focused on this idea of how do you run switching interviews? How do you do this qualitative research? How do you study the cycle of progress? How do you formulate those desire for progress statements? And how do you determine promoting and blocking forces? Right. So we'll pause there for a little Q&A, and then we'll move on to the next 2 stages of the demand. All right. So we're going to talk about the pattern stage right next. And so the idea of the pattern stage is that we're starting to see some repeatability across buyers, that there starts to be some common patterns in terms of what people are hiring, why they're hiring us, the value of the product offering, and so forth. And so here's where we start this transition into what I would call more studying job to be done as a process and being more measurement and quantitative in relation to these questions, more how many, how much with segments and so forth. And so part of the activity of jobs to be done as a process is to be able to map and define all of these core functional jobs. And the framework that's used is this concept of beginning, middle, end, and mapping the job from start to finish and understanding not only the jobs to be done, but the steps to be done within each job, outcomes that people are seeking to achieve in relation to the jobs in terms of what they're seeking to achieve. And then looking for gaps in terms of priorities of outcomes, and outcomes. And so when you do job mapping, and in this context, we're referring to a framework by Jim Callback, which is called the Jobs to be Done 2.0 Canvas. You're looking to map from start to end the main job. And in this case, the main job we've identified as manage company spend to maintain control and improve financial efficiency. So we're literally defining the what and how you do that from start to end, but also related jobs that our targeted customers need to track and reconcile expenses, that they need to monitor compliance, that they need to prepare financial reports for leaders, that they need to approve requests, that they need to manage corporate cards and vendor payments. And so in mapping the jobs, you get this complete inventory of all the individual jobs and job steps to be performed by your targeted user base. So now this is where things get challenging, because when it comes to how I evolve my product and which jobs do I serve, right? This inventory of jobs gets rather large rather quickly. 200 plus jobs and outcomes associated with a targeted end user, to which the product is at different stages in terms of the degree to which we deliver that effectively or in relation to meeting the needs. And so here's where we introduce some of our more quantitative methods for studying these jobs to be done. And the goal here is to seek to avoid simply understanding them through job titles. Job titles can be very tricky and dangerous because the individual who defines themselves as a CFO or a controller or accountant isn't the same person depending upon stage of growth, the industry they're in, their skill set or experience, and so forth. And so what we're seeking to uncover is a nuanced definition of job performer versus job to be done. And so there's a basic way of approaching this quantitative analysis, which is referred to as opportunity scoring. And then there's some more advanced methods in relation to thematic analysis, where we're seeking to identify clusters, to segments, where we're trying to identify how different user groups relate to jobs, and then opportunity mapping and definition. So we're going to cover those at a high level. This is part of an upcoming course we're teaching, is how to apply these methods in real life uses. All right. So the idea of opportunity scoring is this idea that once we uncover this inventory of jobs to be done, that we want to assess or score them.
So I just want to know, what are the most useful outcomes metrics to track once you've mapped the jobs? So the research actually shaped the roadmap decisions.
So that's what we're going to dive into, is kind of how we score them. And so you can score the jobs themselves, or you can score the outcomes associated with the jobs. And you do them in somewhat of a similar fashion. So one of the methods of doing that scoring is that we're asking kind of two side-by-side parallel questions. One is, how important is this job to you? So if you remember, we've got jobs relating to tracking and reconciling expenses, allocating budgets across departments, approving purchase requests. We've got this inventory of things people do as part of their daily work or weekly work or monthly closing or annual close or whatever. And we're trying to get the essence of degree of importance to individuals. And then we're in parallel asking, how satisfied are you with your current ability to perform? And so in the context for RAMP, what they were finding was, because people had created this hodgepodge of solutions glued together and poorly integrated and mix of manual and automated processes, that this type of analysis highlighted these unmet needs. And what you're trying to uncover, if you think about this in terms of the modeling, is uncovering things that are high importance and not well supported, versus not trying to address things that are of low importance where the satisfaction's already high. So you're using these parallel analysis to begin to quadrant and identify what we would call overserved jobs, where the solution does more than they even need, or underserved jobs, where there's opportunity to improve that aspect of the product to better serve them. So hopefully if you didn't get the visual, like that general line of thought resonates.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Just by listening to what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So that's what we call opportunity scoring. And you can do that for jobs and you can do that for outcomes. An example of an outcome, if I had a job, if the job is approve purchase requests, the outcome might be to do it real time or to do it, in less time than I do it today. It's more of like the outcome or the more of the performance aspect of doing the job. So that's one form of analysis. Now, what we'll be teaching in this course is how to do some analysis. And you're going to find like some of the basic techniques. If you haven't read this book, I recommend reading it. It's called Jobs to be Done, Theory to Practice by Tony Ulwick. It's an introduction to what's called outcome-driven innovation, or this jobs to be done quantitative method of analysis. What Dominic, Tracy, and myself, Dom's on the call, we're going to be teaching you some advanced methods. And one of the advanced methods is this idea of formulating themes. And it's performed using what's called principal component analysis. And it's this recognition of that you want to steer away from prioritizing the individual jobs themselves and begin to think of them more as clusters, as things people do together, that there's a mix of functional, social, emotional, aspirational jobs that together as a cluster are what people want to do or want to do better. And so this type of analysis helps you figure out what those clusters are. And you can see from the visual that when we analyze these 200 plus jobs and outcomes, we identified these 9 clusters of jobs that go together, that people don't want to do that job partially. They want to do it holistically. And so when it comes to things like reporting accuracy, they want to reconcile reports for leadership. They want to validate expense allocations. They want to make informed business decisions, et cetera. That collectively, that collection of jobs are what constitute reporting accuracy as an outcome, or budget intelligence, or responsible governance, and so forth. So this method of thematic analysis is really powerful in taking what's a very complex thing to do is analyze 200 plus jobs and outcomes and figure out what to build and for whom. And if you begin to boil them down into different clusters, that can help in terms of some of your product strategy and road mapping and so forth. So that's one method we teach. And so, but that's the jobs piece. And so we want to now integrate that into the who we're building it for, because for different roles or job performers, some of these clusters are more critical than others. And so when you think about when you run these types of surveys, you're issuing a survey, let's say in the case of RAMP, in today's world, they would be issuing a survey for 5,000 plus customers who might cross 8 different industry categories, might be across 5 growth stages, might be across 6 different roles, 3 different organization levels, 7 different experience ratings, 4 maturity ratings in terms of maturity of organization, 7 different decisioning aspects. That realm of possibilities gets into the hundreds of thousands of different profiles that you might find, where everyone has very unique and different needs depending upon organizational level, role, stage of growth, industry, and so forth. But to build product, it's very difficult to go one-to-one. So we got to go one to a targeted segment. And so the other method of analysis, which is called latent class analysis, is a way of doing clustering. And in this case, we're trying to map the inventory of jobs across all these different profile elements to come up with a concept of a segment. the who are we building for. And in this part of the analysis, we reached this conclusion that there were four kind of core segments. One we called analytical practitioners, agile operators, strategic leaders, and operational stewards. And then those four different segments, this segment cross themes, help inform where we might invest. So those decisions on who are we building for, where if we're building for analytical practitioners, we're going to focus on operational clarity and reporting accuracy. We're going to focus on the outcomes of validating expense allocations, reconciling expense, streamlining back office reporting, and so forth. If we're designing and building for strategic leaders, we're going to be working on something very different. We're going to be working on strategic stewardship, reporting accuracy, spending policies, approval hierarchies, and so forth. And so what we build as an inventory of jobs to improve as part of our product design change based upon who we're designing and building for. And so this is a very powerful method of taking what's very complex analytically and boiling it down to a set of targeted segments. All right. And then we reach our scaling stage. And this is the, for RAMP, this was the 5,000 customers and more. And this becomes really these strategic decisions. And the best method I've seen for evaluating or determining these decisions of now that we know the targeted clusters of who we might build for is to think about in kind of a simple 2x2 grid, right? From a growth standpoint, are we growing through acquiring new customers through acquisition, or are we growing through retaining existing customers? And so that would point to different strategies for either building to enter, building new things to serve more customers we haven't attracted yet, or building to defend, enhancing the things we've designed and built that are high use so that people don't want to switch off of the way we've designed and engineered. Or from a product readiness standpoint, from where our product is, acquiring now or defending and expanding. So 4 different strategies we could take where the additional inputs are required of we need a good product audit of what's actually been designed and built to date and how well it's functioning. We need some form of competitive map to where our rivals are going and attacking from us in terms of how do we defend our market share, and then our own go-to-market priorities in terms of our strategies and so forth. And so if we have that lens, then we can take those segments and we can begin to map them. So it becomes much clearer what our actual strategy is from a go-to-market standpoint, what quadrant of this grid we're actually in terms of the execution, and the who we're building for and the what we're building. So a simple 2x2 grid that guides some of that investing decisions. And then the last thing I just kind of want to end on is this notion of that it's important to know as well that depending upon what segment you're going after, your messaging is very different. And so I like to think of product market fit and language market fit. And so you want to gear your language in terms of your website and your offerings and your conversations or in and around outcomes that these individuals are trying to seek. The analytical practitioner is trying to move from chaos to clarity. The agile operator is thinking about smarter budgets, stronger impact. Strategic leaders are trying to lead with confidence. Operating stewards are trying to see every dollar in real time. They have very different motivations or needs around them. All right. Hopefully this gave you an education on these 2 different lenses: jobs as progress, jobs as process, how they relate to answering different questions you might have in the 4 stages of demand. We have 2 upcoming courses. We have a workshop that we're doing on July 8th, jobs to be done switch interviews. So that's oriented around jobs as progress. And then we have a course, job to be done quantified, occurring in August. And that's all about these quantitative methods. And so it's oriented around defining the market. We use the market definition canvas to do that, which is an OLWIC framework. How you move from qualitative to quantitative. So this job mapping process. We go into how you actually design the surveys themselves, how you field the surveys, how you do the data analysis and tab formation and banners, and then these different methods for thematic analysis, clustering, segmenting. And then we teach it using Display R, an actual product for doing this type of quantitative or statistical type of research. Really just it empowers you. The tooling is really progressed over time. And so during the course, you get free access to the Display R product. And so as we go through the exercises step by step, you work side by side with us doing all the different activities to learn how might apply these quantified methods to my own area or focus. All right. So with that, we'll wrap up for today's session. If you have any questions about these courses, you can reach out via LinkedIn. Dom Rachetti, who co-teaching the upcoming course with, is here as well to field any questions. He's noted in the chat. What's great about these new tools is oftentimes a barrier to doing this kind of work has been the level of statistical knowledge you need to perform it. We're going to teach you the why you do it and why you pick different methods. And you're going to find that the tooling is there to really empower you. And so doing this type of research is much easier than it has been traditionally. So great course for diving in the how-to for doing this type of quantified job to be done research. Any questions as we wrap up? All right. So let me put a couple of links in the chat. If you want to know where to find the courses, link in the chat for the jobs to be done quantified, and then a link in the chat for the upcoming switch interviews. And then we'll be emailing out some additional resources as well, just to give you some further background and context on some of the topics we highlighted today. All right. With that, thank you for attending. Do share out this talk. If there's colleagues or people in your network that you think would love to jump in and learn more from this particular lightning lesson, do spread the word, share it out on LinkedIn, and hopefully we'll see you in an upcoming cohort. Thank you all.